subsidize bad help. And to do that, I looked at sort of the history of farm policy in the US. The period I'm going to focus on here deals with the Nixon administration. Up until the Nixon administration, talking early 1970s is the exact time period I'm in on here. US farm policy was basically governed by mechanisms that would limit production. So the way the USDA would help keep farm incomes high is they would sometimes pay farmers not to farm, because if supply was limited, that kept the market demand, and the market demand stayed somewhat constant, farmers could command higher prices, they could afford to farm and feed their families. Under Nixon and his Ag Secretary, Earl Butz, this policy was reversed 180 degrees. From now on, farmers were going to be paid solely based on production. The new mandate was grow as much food as possible, and we're going to sell it for as cheaply as possible in supermarkets. Now, instead of limiting production and paying farmers not to farm, farmers were given direct payments, subsidies, and price support simply to encourage production. So one way to kind of highlight how important these subsidies and price supports and direct payments have been in leading to the ag situation we're in now, I have a quick question. How many of you have seen the documentary King Corn? Came out a couple years ago. Anybody? Okay. If you haven't seen it, and I'd really recommend it, it's basically these two guys from Harvard end up going out to Iowa because they just had read a report, and they just got out of school. They read a report that said that their generation might have shorter lives than that of their parents. And so they were trying to trace this back to diet, and they wanted to understand how corn came to play such a large role in the American diet. So through some incredibly strange irony, it turns out that they actually had great-grandparents from the same small town in rural Iowa. So they returned to that town. They rented 1 acre of corn, or just 1 acre from a farmer there, and grew corn. So when they grow this corn, they get to the very end of the harvest, and they look at what they actually made from this, and they realize they didn't make any money. They actually lost $20 just accounting for all their production costs. But when they accounted for the government support that they received, they actually made $20 when the direct payment was factored in, which was $28 per acre, plus some other insurance provisions that were included. All right, so $20 doesn't sound like a lot, but this is 1 acre. Now a lot of corn farms, including the one that I worked with in South Dakota, are 10,000 acres. And you're talking about a $400,000 swing here. That's the difference between becoming wealthy and going broke. So we know that these policies are getting somewhat of their desired outcome. So back to corn. If you look at corn, it really has become the staple of the American diet. We produce so much corn, you're going to be astonished at some of these numbers. Last year, the US grew somewhere around 13 billion bushels of corn. That's about 40% of the total world harvest. Now, of this 13 billion bushels, we end up exporting about 20% of it or so. Now that's good. The US, we do get a lot of credit for our food aid and support programs, and that's a good thing. Somewhere around 40% of it is now used for ethanol. That's somewhat controversial because you do have the food and fuel debates, but that's not really a topic here, though I'm happy to take questions about it afterwards. And remaining about 5.5 billion bushels are then used for commercial feedlots. So that could be cattle, it could be poultry, it could even be salmon or tilapia, because those are corn-fed now too when they're farm-raised, or even shrimp, which leaves about 1.3 billion bushels remaining that go directly into the commercial food supply. How much is 1.3 billion bushels? That's 2,000 years of corn for every person in this country. We need to come up with something to do with all this corn. It's amazing to look at the yields. 1 acre of corn produces 10,000 pounds of food after it's been harvested, and just Iowa alone grows enough corn to easily feed the entire US. It's unbelievable. But it's important to note here that the corn that we're talking about, this isn't the sweet corn that you would buy at the grocery store. This is actually a very, very highly genetically engineered modification. Basically a corn that's bred because it's a very easy, good, versatile industrial input to production. So it's kind of ironic because you're thinking about these Iowa corn farmers who are growing enough corn to feed all the US, and yet they can't even feed their family with their yield because they're growing input and not food. It's amazing. So what are we going to do with all this corn? Well, one of the things that we've done is you now see the emergence of high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup, that was the single most direct factor that got me interested in this topic to begin with. I was trying to figure out why it was in everything I was eating, and it's probably in most of the things you guys consume on a daily basis. The consumption of high fructose corn syrup from the time of Nixon and Earl Butz, it was 0 pounds per person. Today it's somewhere around 70 pounds a person. It's actually fallen a little bit since the middle of the last decade when people started becoming a little more conscious of this. But high fructose corn syrup really is a direct byproduct of having cheap corn, where we produced a lot of it, and all of a sudden it became very economical to make this alternative sweetener out of it. And I'm not here to say that, natural cane-based sugar is the answer, because the simple fact is that sweeteners, by definition, are not good for you in any type of large quantity. So it's really important to, kind of pay attention to this right here. One thing I will say, though, is that high fructose corn syrup has been shown scientifically that it's metabolized differently in the body. Within that, when you have something with high fructose corn syrup, and it might be a Sprite or Coca-Cola or whatever, it doesn't trigger insulin production in the pancreas. So within that, you actually don't get that signal that you've eaten, which can actually lead some people to continue eating because you don't get that satisfied feeling of being full. So that's one of the challenges. There are other challenges linking high fructose corn syrup consumption with magnesium and iron deficiencies and all these other kind of bad things. Now, if I had brought my PowerPoints with me, I'd show you a graph right now, and the graph would basically show the increase in obesity and diabetes over the last 30 years. Like I said, we're talking about doubling, tripling, and getting worse. And I'd also show you a graph of high fructose corn syrup consumption, and I bet if I took the labels off, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between which graph is which. Now, it's basically impossible to show any sort of causality here. I worked so hard with Bill to try to figure out how I could do it, using econometrics and this other stuff. You can't do it. Dietary diseases, and these dietary diseases are too complex, there are too many environmental factors and inputs, that you can't isolate one thing as being the root cause. That said, the correlation's amazing. When you look at the graphics, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to think that there's something going on between high fructose corn syrup consumption and some of these dietary diseases that we're having. So that's kind of what's going on with the high fructose corn syrup that's coming out of the commercial corn that gets processed. But another major challenge is the 5.5 billion bushels of corn that go to commercial feedlots. So commercial feedlots are probably, that would be one of the, you can put me anywhere in the world, that's one place I would never really want to be. I know, because I've gone through them. They aren't pretty places. If you're there and you're running a feedlot, your goal is to fatten up that cow. So you do that by feeding them and restricting movement. It's really simple. It's the same reason we're getting fatter too. We're eating more and we aren't moving as much. So within that, we're actually feeding them corn because it's so cheap and plentiful and we have so much of it. Cattle, they weren't raised to feed on corn. Now, if you actually fed a cow corn for about 150 days, it would die. And that's even considering the fact that the corn they're fed is infused with antibiotics. Another amazing statistic, 70% of the antibiotics used in the US, including the ones that we take, are used in feedlots. And that's because when these cattle are consuming their corn, it triggers a whole bunch of nasty things that go on in the stomach and the digestive tract, where the acidity rises, the pH level drops, they get ulcers, stomach holes, it's not good. So what does this really mean? Well, if you look at the muscle tissue for a cow raised in a commercial feedlot versus a lean grass-fed cow who's probably happier walking around grazing, you see that if you just look at a T-bone steak, the amount of saturated fat in that grass-fed cow, about 1.3 grams. The amount of saturated fat in that corn-fed confined cow is about 9 grams. So again, when we're looking at the nutritional quality of our food here, that's also a concern. So going back to the objectives of Nixon and Butz, we desired, we sought cheap food. We definitely achieved cheap food. We pay less for than anywhere in the world. Like I had mentioned, the amount that we spend on food as a percentage of our income has fallen by more than half. But at the same time, the amount we spend on healthcare is more than triple. So that savings has more than been offset by the fact that we're eating ourselves into a more unhealthy lifestyle. Now, there's some other challenges with the way agriculture has evolved. And one of them is that the environmental toll of agriculture has increased exponentially to support these large-scale commercial factory farm, monoculture productions. The amount of fossil fuel, U.S. agriculture is now the largest user of fossil fuels in the economy, somewhere around 20% a year. And all the pesticides and fertilizers, that's primarily made out of natural gas. All the farm equipment run on oil for the most part, and that's not a bad thing because, again, if you look at the yields, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but if you look at the amount of carbon energy it actually takes, number of fossil fuel calories it takes to grow 1 calorie of food, it's about 10 to 1, whereas 50 years ago it's about 1/20th to 1. So, we do have a trade-off here that isn't completely accounted for. And another environmental challenge goes back to those cattle feedlots. So 70,000 head of cattle, that's a pretty, it's a large scale, but pretty common size of a cattle feedlot in eastern Colorado. Those 70,000 cattle produce as much waste annually as a city of 1 million people. It's amazing. Over 1 million people. And again, that's because when you are focusing on your specialization and just raising the cattle, whereas in the natural context, these cows would be grazing, their manure then would actually fertilize the soil. It's this whole, very harmonious cycle. You lose that, and in this commercial context, the waste products are no longer a helpful fertilizer, it's just waste. So another challenge that really abounds is in food safety. Last year, there were around 75,000 cases of foodborne illness that required hospitalization in the U.S., and the cost of food recalls is somewhere around 60 or 70 billion a year. The reason why is because as we've focused on aggregation, we've been able to make food very cheap, and the supply chains are incredibly efficient in getting all these calories out to us in the most cost-efficient way. The problem is that we lose track of where our food comes from, and so only about 1% of the food we eat is traceable from farm to fork. So every time we go to the grocery store and we're making a purchase, we're actually making a bet that this product we're buying is safe, and we're just taking the company's word for it. You don't think of eating as being a dangerous act, but to 75,000 people, it's become a pretty dangerous act. Again, this happens because as we focus on the aggregation, when a farmer grows his corn and drops it off at the grain elevator, no idea what happens to it. A kind of case study that puts this into perspective, a lot of you probably remember, it was a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, the large-scale recalls of spinach in the U.S. What happened is, a couple bags of spinach had become infected with E. coli. The U.S. government wasn't sure how much, and of more relevance, they didn't know where it came from. So what happens? Basically mass hysteria with all spinach being pulled from the U.S. market. We weren't able to track it down to one distribution center, or truck, or supermarket, or farm, or wholesaler, or any of that. We had no idea where it came from. So when you think about some of these evolving terrors and threats and everything else, look at our food supply, because this is a major risk factor that a lot of people aren't putting into any kind of consideration right now. So looking at this sort of raised up a level, it becomes fairly clear that U.S. farm policy has sort of forgotten that the whole problem of health in soil and plants and animals and then in man is one great subject. Eating is an agricultural act. Agriculture is fundamentally tied to health and nutrition. One of the quotes that I have gone back on quite a bit is back to Harry Truman in 1946. And then he remarked, "No nation is healthier than their children or more prosperous than their farmers." All right, well right now our children aren't very healthy, and we don't have very many prosperous farmers, although we do have some incredibly wealthy agribusinesses. We're talking maybe about 5 of them that really control the by and large majority of this market. So as we're looking at greater stratification of wealth across the U.S. economy and who the winners and losers are, it's no longer farmers. In fact, for a given product that you'll buy in a grocery store, only about 10% of that cost actually goes back to the farmer. The rest of it's all value added at different parts in the supply chain, production, all of that.